Well, would you look at that, it's October again, meaning it's time to play a spooky game. And while there are a ton of spooky games I could play, like Escape James Charles and Area 51 on Roblox, I think I'm gonna keep it kinda basic and hop on my GameCube and start Luigi's Mansion instead, which I was luckily able to add to my collection pretty recently, which I'm gonna say it feels pretty nice to finally have a launch title of the GameCube, which is nice since the GameCube is actually one of my favorite consoles of all time. But with all that said, why don't we roll that intro and let's start this video on Luigi's Mansion for the GameCube. So, Luigi's Mansion is funny enough a launch title for the GameCube, which I find to be a bit bold on Nintendo's part since, well, when the GameCube and Luigi's Mansion were both revealed, the competition already had released their new consoles. While Nintendo at that point just released Dr. Mario 64 like a month before E3. But that's all in the past, and the important thing is that the game released in 2001 for both Japan and America, and in 2002 in Europe, which means that the Japanese version is now 20 and that the American version will be 20 years old in November of this year, which makes me feel old since I also turned 20 this year. So the game starts out with this cutscene where we see our boy Luigi on his way to this big old mansion. When he enters it, it's almost like it's abandoned. Well, that is, until out of nowhere this key is mysteriously flying around. Luigi then grabs that key and uses it on his big door, where inside he meets with this old guy named Professor Egat, a scientist who lives really close to the mansion, which, speaking of the mansion, for some reason it just started to appear out of nowhere just a few days ago. And since Luigi is still a young lad in Egat's eyes, he trusts him with the Poltergust 3000 and the Game Boy Horror, and with those two items Luigi heads into the mansion so he can suck up some ghosts and find Mario, who also went to the mansion a bit before Luigi. And well, I think the story suits the game pretty well, especially since it's a bit more complex than most of the plotlines of the Mario franchise, but it works for the game since just one look at it and it's immediately clear that this isn't like your standard Mario platformer. And now we go on to the gameplay. So Luigi's Mansion is what I mentioned, a pretty different game compared to any other Mario game, where in a normal Mario game you will be running and jumping through colorful worlds. In Luigi's Mansion instead, you slowly traverse through this haunted mansion while on the lookout for ghosts, and you also have to locate Mario. But speaking of those ghosts, how do we catch them? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So, when you encounter a ghost, you want to get as close as possible and then shine your light on them. And if you're close enough to the ghost, then you got to press the big ol' R button as fast as possible. Since ghosts stay stunned for only like 2 to 3 seconds, which is not a lot. You then also have to tilt the analog stick to the opposite of the ghost, since this will allow you to make the suck of the poltergust a lot stronger, making capturing ghosts just a tad easier. But capturing ghosts is not the only thing the poltergust is useful for, since later on in the game Luigi can find these medals that allow him to suck up fire, water and ice, which then also allows him to shoot out those elements with the poltergust. And with those in the game allows the player to actually solve some more advanced puzzles and even capture ghosts who need to be first affected by one of the elements before they can be sucked up. Then Luigi also has his trusty Game Boy Horror, which doesn't do all that much besides being a map and a tracking device for ghosts and money, and also a communication device that allows Professor Egat to communicate with Luigi. And while that's cool and all, it doesn't do much for the gameplay, especially since you can't even call Egat on your own. The game only makes him call Luigi at certain points through the game, meaning that if you really want to see his face, I guess you just gotta get a picture of him and put it somewhere in your room. But besides that, the gameplay in general is pretty repetitive, since even though you get access to elemental powers like 9 out of 10 times, you don't really need them. And it kinda makes the gameplay more repetitive than it already is, since like 90% of the time in the game you'll be going from room to room, just looking to find ghosts to then open up another room, and then you do that rinse and repeat. But the game luckily somewhat compensates it with the explorations as well. The mansion in itself is pretty solid and fun to explore, and this mainly comes from how the mansion is structured. Like wow, it actually looks like it's structured in a way a real mansion would be. Like on the bottom floor you go from a dining room right into a kitchen, which is something that is pretty normal in most households. But that's not the only thing. Besides some normal rooms, the mansion also has a variety of really interesting rooms. Like there's this music room where after you activate all the instruments, this ghost plays a classic Mario song and then asks you questions about it. And then later on in the game you will encounter this room where you have to shoot down the freaking moon with a shooting star, which after doing that the room reveals a path which leads to a star which also belonged to Mario. But speaking of that ghost, well, her name is Melody, and she is a portrait ghost, which is a ghost that used to live in the painting, but because the mansion appeared out of nowhere, they got set free and now live their lives in the mansion. And since they for some reason have some of the keys of the mansion, Luigi has to defeat them. And well, I think they're pretty neat, since all of them do require a different approach to being defeated. Like, Melody can be sucked up right after she's done attacking, while there's this other ghost who can only be defeated after Luigi sprays some water on her bed, so she thinks she has wet her bed. Which I'm kinda stunned by how dumb and evil it is for Luigi to do. But those two are actually a lower class of portrait ghost. Since well, they're just mini bosses, and well, the higher class portrait ghosts are the main boss of this game, and well, I'm a big fan of them, since all of them are in my opinion relatively cool. Like let's take the first boss for an example, Chauncey the baby ghost, who when the fight starts takes Luigi right into this giant crypt into another dimension, and in the fight you have to avoid some baby toys until you can attack him with, well, one of his toys. And this is a really solid and cool fight, especially since the other two main bosses, well cool, they're kinda meh. Like there's this one that kinda looks like Baldergeist if he didn't have the stone armor, and then there's just a giant Boo, which in my opinion is kinda lazy, but the Boos are the original Mario ghosts, so it would also be kinda weird if they didn't show up. But they do show up, and in fact, throughout the game you will encounter plenty of them. In fact, you actually wanna hunt them down, since capturing them is required to beat the game. But also because anytime you encounter a new one, they will make a pun with the word Boo, like Bulligan or Boomio, which I just think is beautiful. But how did these Boos get here? Well, that's simple. Early on in the game, Luigi opens his vault, which reveals the hideout of the Boos. And since the hideout isn't safe anymore, they flee and hide in a bunch of rooms throughout the mansion. This is also where we meet the true villain of this game, King Boo. And also a fun fact, this King Boo is actually quite different from the one that appears in Mario Sunshine. And he's actually the one that let this mansion appear out of nowhere, meaning that he is also the reason Luigi for some reason won this mansion. And he also captured Mario and turned him into a painting. And since apparently Boos are a lot stronger when they're in a group, Luigi is unable to confront King Boo until a bunch of Boos have been caught. And let me tell you, I really like this, since not only did King Boo get revealed in a pretty cool way, if you ask me, especially with the Boos you have to catch, so that you can eventually take on King Boo. And I'm gonna be honest, if it wasn't for this, I probably would have forgotten about like maybe 50% of the rooms in the mansion, since most of them are just capture the ghost, grab the key, and then you basically don't have to go in that room anymore. Unless you want to check if there was some money laying around, which even though this mansion is technically not real, for some reason the money you find throughout the game is real. And the money also doesn't have that much of a use in this game, which is a bit of a bummer, and the use that it actually has isn't all that special either. So after you beat the game, you get graded on how much money you got, and depending on how much you had collected, you will get a rank, which does nothing except for showing you that Luigi bought a house with all of the money he got from this adventure. But speaking of this adventure, let's end it. So after having obtained enough Boos, Luigi enters the basement again, where the force field of King Boo breaks, allowing him to enter his room. Here we meet up with King Boo again, which in the frustration of seeing being Luigi again, uses his power to turn the Mario painting into a Bowser painting, which sucks up Luigi. Then Luigi gets teleported to the roof of the mansion, where King Boo gets in this giant Bowser puppet, which, considering that Luigi is actually quite scared of Bowser, makes this fight a bit more interesting. So, onto the fight itself. The Bowser puppet has actually a bit of a small amount of attacks it can use. He can be fire, throw some spiky balls, and he can run towards you. And the attacks aren't that hard to dodge, but with Luigi being so slow, it can sometimes be a bit tricky to dodge them. But after hitting the puppet with a spiky ball, King Boo will come out and it's time to suck him up. And you basically rinse and repeat until you fully sucked up King Boo. And after the battle is done, Luigi gets transported back to the room, where he grabs the Mario painting and brings it back to Egad, which uses his big old machine he used on the ghost earlier on, but he turns it on in reverse, which allows Mario to be brought back. Luigi then laughs a bit since Mario has something stuck on him, and bam, those are the credits. Well, that's Luigi's Mansion. All in all, I gotta say that if you haven't played this game, I highly recommend it, since not only is it a really good game, but it's also a game that we most likely will not see appear on any console anytime soon. And that's because the game got a remake on the 3DS, and because Nintendo is kinda slow with releasing their old stuff. So maybe in a couple of years we'll finally see GameCube on Nintendo Switch. But anyways, if you're able to find this game for cheap, I highly recommend picking it up, and I will guarantee you that you have a great time with it. But this is gonna be doing it for now, and if you would all excuse me, I'm gonna be watching the Pikmin trailer that is included in this game for some reason. And well, then I guess I will have to see you all later, so see ya!